You were talking about like CTV being a net new channel for you. How are you gauging those lift results for this net new channel on the onset? Or was it just like kind of just like testing, getting some lift results, and then running another incrementality test afterwards and comparing it to the V1 test? Or how are you gauging, I guess? And were you maybe comparing to other channels or maybe third-party benchmarks or something like that?
I want to make sure I understand. There's a lot in that question, but just to kind of ground us again in how the test was run, we created like a group of geos that was representative of a national scale up, right? So we basically said, hey, what does our audience look like nationally? And then how can we find geographic areas that would give us enough to give you a representative sample of what it looks like to be nationally? And so our goal was, what happens when we're able to be successful in this target market? And then if that is successful, then we should then be able to scale that up nationally. I think it was like a $10 million number that we were looking at, Madan. And that should prove out because you're going to get into new audiences that are similar to the audiences on which you're targeting. We also, when we apply to those geos, those targeted geos, that's kind of like a nice little mix, right? So imagine our entire audience is a sandwich. We just took a slice of the corner of the sandwich that had each of those ingredient layers in it, right? So that's what we're testing on. But we also held out from all the other places. And so we're looking at our baseline and the areas in which we made this focused spiked investment in CTV, right? Now, it's going to impact other channels, right? So CTV will impact branded search, right? CTV will impact your click-through rate on TikTok or on Instagram or something along those lines. But the causal part is CTV. So we actually don't look at any attribution when we're doing this. We're just looking at total dollars that are coming in, total conversions, total new customers and repeat customers. And we're looking at those lifts versus the control group. And we're interpreting that to mean like CTV is driving this upper and mid funnel demand. And even if it gets captured somewhere in the lower middle, the lower funnels, that's okay. We're not worried about that. We're just focused on how to drive incremental investment in CTV. Did that answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, I think so. So you were looking at like the halo effect basically of
Right.
CTV in these specific geos, and then just kind of, but then when you saw like a lift in say search or TikTok, let's say it was like 3%, like how do you know that's good? Or like, or any lift, a detectable lift, basically perceived as like CTV is doing its job?
I think so, because all other variables were being held constant as much as possible, right? So any lift in that. So I'm like I guess if you boil it down, you have retargeting, like remarketing ads and like branded ads, right? Like we wouldn't necessarily say that, hey, if we saw a lift there is because that branded search ad is so much better. Like our branded paid search is doing so much better, right? Like most practitioners would say that that's not a value. That's just a net there to catch the actual value that's coming from CTV. So yeah, we discounted any incremental value coming from those channels, and thought of it as really being driven by our CTV investment. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you
The
so much for
measurement
that.
is on the actual outcomes, the sales outcomes, on the
Yeah.
new customer revenue and the returning customer revenue. So to your question is, maybe if you look at the UTM branded search ROAS, maybe it went up. But as Sam's pointing out, he doesn't care about that. He's looking at the actual lift in sales outcomes and then interpreting that as a causal sort of ROAS. Causal ROAS was strong in many of these cases. And now you're saying you might find that the UTM ROAS actually is much better in retargeting, much better in TikTok, much better wherever. Okay, it's kind of cool.
But in the MMM, right, Madan, like we would see that those channels are actually not quite causal. So, Mike, like when we think about the overall how we apply the MMM versus the UTM or for the channel like platform-based attribution, we discount it pretty heavily based upon what the MMM says. So platform can say it's a 15 ROAS, but we can discount that 80% or 90% based upon what the MMM is telling us that actual incremental ROAS. So I think it's about taking that MMM, which should be refreshed pretty often and is informed by incrementality. So Madonna is saying trusted sources of incrementality, going into MMM, informing and giving you a kind of a mix of how each channel is doing from a ROAS perspective, looking at the platform or reported ROAS versus the MMM and discounting it, right? And so for every 5 conversions coming from branded search, I might only count 1 towards that actual channel. I mean, that's kind of oversimplifying it, but that's the discounting that we do.